On a Tuesday morning in Norfolk, Virginia, a United States Navy captain grabbed a woman by the arm, slammed her against a server rack, and ended his own career without firing a single shot. That is where this story begins. Not with the woman, not yet, with the man. Captain Ellison Fenn arrived at NTC-7 Sentinel at 0614 that morning, 14 minutes before his scheduled time, which was itself 30 minutes before anyone else was required to be there. He did this every day. Not because the regulations demanded it, because he needed those 44 minutes alone on the command deck before the noise began. Before the junior officers filed in with their coffee and their nervous energy and their need to be seen performing competence for a man who had very little patience for performance. He stood at the center of the bridge in the blue half-light and let the hum of the servers fill the space around him. NTC-7 Sentinel was the most advanced naval cyber warfare simulation facility in the United States. Buried beneath Naval Station Norfolk, it occupied 3 underground floors and ran on a quantum processing core that cost more than most destroyers. The command deck alone was 40 meters wide. The holographic display at its center could render a full carrier strike group in real time down to the fuel consumption of individual aircraft. The place smelled like cold metal and recycled air and something faintly chemical that no one had ever been able to identify. Fenn loved it. He loved it the way certain men love the things they have conquered. He had taken command 6 months earlier, and in those 6 months, he had reshaped the facility in his own image. Tighter protocols, faster drills, a culture of precision that some of his crew found exhilarating and others found quietly suffocating. He did not particularly distinguish between those two groups. Results were results. The machine ran the way he told it to run. He walked to his personal station at the forward edge of the command deck and set down his cover with the same deliberate placement he used every morning, squared, brim forward. He opened the top drawer of the console to retrieve his stylus and his hand stopped. The photograph. It was small, a standard service portrait, the kind taken every few years. His father, Rear Admiral Douglas Fenn, United States Navy, retired. Dress whites, 4 rows of ribbons, eyes that looked at the camera the way a man looks at something he is about to inspect for deficiencies. Ellison had carried that photograph for 11 years. He could not have told you why he still had it. His father had been dead for 4 of those years, and their relationship in the 7 before that had been conducted primarily through formal correspondence and the occasional phone call that felt like a performance review. Douglas Fenn had never said the words his son needed to hear. Not once. Not in 43 years. And Ellison, who had graduated first in his class, who had been decorated twice in the Gulf and once in the Pacific, who had been handed command of the most sophisticated training facility in the Naval Service, still opened that drawer every morning and looked at a dead man's face and felt the particular hollowness of a question that was never going to be answered. He closed the drawer. He picked up his stylus. He did not look at the photograph again. By 700, the command deck was alive. 16 personnel at their stations, another 8 rotating through the secondary terminals along the port and starboard walls. The morning briefing ran 11 minutes, during which Fenn corrected 2 junior officers by name and praised none. Praise, in his experience, was a currency best spent sparingly. You spent it too freely and it lost its value. You spent it not at all and people worked twice as hard trying to earn it. Today's primary exercise was Black Spear, a full-scale simulated fleet engagement scenario involving 4 carrier strike groups, 2 opposing submarine packages, and a live cyber intrusion component that would test the facility's defenses against a simulated state-level adversary. It was the most complex exercise NTC-7 had ever attempted. Fenn had designed the parameters himself over the course of 3 weeks. He considered it close to his finest work. Ensign Garrett Pryor arrived at 0658, 2 minutes before his shift began, which put him exactly on the acceptable side of Fenn's informal threshold. Pryor was 23 years old and had been at NTC-7 for 4 months. He was not the most technically gifted officer on the deck. He was not the fastest or the loudest or the most decorated. What he was, without knowing the word for it yet, was curious. He looked at systems the way a child looks at a clock left open on a workbench, not to use it, to understand it, to find out what it does when no one is watching. He took his station at the secondary monitoring console on the starboard side, 3rd position from the aft bulkhead. He had learned early not to draw attention to himself on this deck. Fenn's attention was not something you sought out. It found you when it wanted you, and when it found you, the experience was efficient and unpleasant in equal measure. The morning settled into its rhythm, voices low, fingers moving across keyboards. The holographic display at the center of the deck cycling through pre-exercise checks, the 3-dimensional map of the simulation theater rotating slowly in blue and green light. Black Spear was 90 minutes from initiation. The deck smelled of coffee and anticipation. That was when Garrett Pryor looked up from his console and saw her. She was standing near the primary command node, not at it, near it. There is a difference, and Pryor registered the difference without being able to say why it mattered. She was not interacting with the system. She was not waiting to interact with it. She was simply standing in its proximity, the way a person stands near something they understand very well and have no need to prove. She wore an olive drab flight suit, the kind issued to naval aviators. Old enough that the fabric had softened at the elbows and knees the way fabric does when it has been worn by someone who actually works in it. There were no rank insignia, no name tape, no unit patch, no wings, no ribbons, nothing on the suit that told you anything about the person inside it, except that she had been somewhere and done something and was not interested in advertising either. She was holding a tablet. Her eyes were on the screen, but her attention, Pryor felt, was elsewhere. He had no rational basis for that feeling. He noted it anyway. She was a woman in her late 50s, he estimated, short hair going silver at the temples, a face that was not severe and was not soft, a face that had made a great many calculations and arrived at its present stillness through practice rather than temperament. She had the posture of someone who had long ago decided that the precise angle of her spine was the one variable in any room she could always control. In her chest pocket, barely visible, was the coiled end of a small cable. Interface hardware. Legacy equipment, the kind that had been superseded by wireless protocols years ago. He noticed it the way you notice a detail that does not quite fit the pattern of everything around it. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. Then he looked back. She hadn't moved. He did not approach her. He did not flag her presence to anyone else on the deck. He told himself later that he had meant to, that he had simply been waiting for the right moment. But the truth, which he would only admit to himself much later, was that something about the way she stood made him reluctant to disturb her, as though the disturbance would cost him something he could not name. No one else on the deck seemed to notice her at all. Captain Ellison Fenn noticed her at 0731. He was crossing the deck from the forward command station to the central holographic display, reviewing the Black Spear pre-exercise telemetry on his own tablet when he registered in his peripheral vision an anomaly. Something that did not fit the pattern he had imposed on this space. He stopped walking. He turned his head. He took her in the way he took in everything. Quickly, completely. His eyes moved from her feet to her face in approximately 1 second and returned a verdict he had already half formed before the scan was complete. Civilian analyst, or possibly a contractor. Some low-level intelligence billet that had sent her to the wrong floor. It happened occasionally. The facility shared a building with 2 other commands, and the signage was, in Fenn's opinion, inadequate. He had noted this in his quarterly report. Nothing had been done. He crossed to her in 6 steps. She did not look up. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be undeniably present. She did not adjust, did not register, did not offer the small physical acknowledgments that people offer when a senior officer enters their space. She simply continued examining whatever was on her screen. "Ma'am," his voice carried its full weight, controlled, certain. "I don't know what billet you wandered out of, but this is the Fleet Cybernetics command deck. This is not a transit corridor, and it is not a reading room. Take your tablet and walk back out the way you came." Nothing. The deck had gone quiet around them in the way that a room goes quiet when people who are pretending to work stop pretending. No one looked directly. Everyone was watching. "Ma'am," harder now, "I gave you a direct order." She turned a page on her tablet. She did not look up. There are moments in the lives of certain men when the gap between who they believe themselves to be and who they actually are becomes suddenly briefly visible. For Ellison Fenn, this was not one of those moments. He did not experience the gap. He stepped across it without seeing it. He closed the remaining distance in 2 strides. His right hand came up and took her arm above the elbow. He turned his body using his weight and moved her. Not gently. With the definite physical authority of a man who has never been told that his authority has a perimeter. She hit the server back with her shoulder blades. The sound was a flat metallic crack, not loud but dense. It carried. The deck went absolutely silent. Fenn leaned in, not close enough to be something else, close enough to be a wall. "For the last time," he said, low, tight, the voice of a man who is absolutely certain he is the most important person in the room. "Identify yourself and your purpose on this deck, or I will have you in the brig before this exercise begins." Admiral Claire Weston looked up from her tablet. Her eyes were gray, not the gray of cold weather or hard stone. the gray of still water, deep water, the kind that has no interest in reflecting your image back to you. She looked at him. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. She looked the way a physician looks at a symptom, interested, methodical, already composing the diagnosis. She said nothing. And in the back of the room, in the shadow beside the aft entrance, Commodore Bernard Krause, who had arrived at the facility 20 minutes earlier and had not announced himself, watched the tableau with the stillness of a man who was watching something he had feared and hoped would not happen, and had privately known would happen eventually. He had served 31 years in the United States Navy. He had commanded a carrier strike group in the North Atlantic and a special operations task force in the Persian Gulf. He had shaken hands with 3 presidents and buried 11 men he had personally selected for missions. He was not, by any reasonable assessment, a man who frightened easily. His face in this moment was the color of old chalk. He had recognized Claire Weston the moment he saw her standing by the command node. He had recognized the way she stood before he recognized her face. There was a stance that very specific people developed over very specific careers, a way of occupying space that was simultaneously unassuming and immovable. He had seen it in exactly 3 people in his career. All of them had clearances so classified that their names appeared in no public record and their work appeared in no official history. He had known the moment he walked through that aft door what this visit meant. He had not anticipated Fenn moving that fast. He watched now and did not intervene because intervening was not his role in this moment, and because some things have to be allowed to complete themselves before the correction can begin. On Pryor's console 3rd position from the aft bulkhead starboard side, a line appeared. It was small. One line among thousands of active data streams cycling across his secondary monitoring screen. He would not have seen it at all if he had not at that precise moment been looking at the wrong place for the right reasons. It was the color white. Everything else on his screen was blue-green or amber. The status indicators, the telemetry feeds, the pre-exercise system checks, cycling through their final sequences before Black Spear went live. All of it was within normal parameters. All of it was the color it was supposed to be. This single line was white. He didn't know what it meant. He leaned slightly closer to the screen. He tapped it. Nothing happened. He made a note of the timestamp in the location within the data architecture. He wasn't sure why he bothered. It was probably nothing. An artifact of the pre-exercise load sequence, a rendering quirk in the monitoring software. He looked back at the center of the deck, where Captain Fenn was still pressed close to the woman he had pushed against the server rack, speaking to her in the low-controlled voice that on this deck preceded consequences. Pryor looked back at his screen. The white line was gone. He stared at the place where it had been. He made another note. At 07:48 with Black Spear. 32 minutes from initiation and the command deck running at full operational tempo, the first alarm sounded. It was not the alarm for Black Spear. The Black Spear alarm was a low 2-tone signal, almost musical, designed to be unobtrusive enough not to spike cortisol before an exercise began. This alarm was different. This alarm was the sound of a system realizing it was in trouble and attempting to communicate that realization through every channel simultaneously. The main holographic display dissolved. The map of the simulation theater, the carrier strike groups, the submarine tracks, the opposing force markers, all of it simply stopped existing. In its place was red, a specific shade of red that no one on the deck had seen outside of training manuals and theoretical briefings. The shade that appeared in the section of the manual labeled Protocol Omega. Protocol Omega was a failsafe. It had been designed into NTC-7's architecture from the beginning, buried in the system's deepest layer, a last resort mechanism that would activate if the facility's network detected what it classified as a catastrophic external cyber intrusion event. It was designed to seal the network completely, lock every system, isolate every subsystem, create a digital quarantine so complete that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. It had never been activated. It had barely been tested. It existed in the consciousness of the facility's personnel, roughly the way a nuclear option exists in the consciousness of a diplomat, as a theoretical boundary, something that defined the outer edge of the possible without being a thing you ever expected to actually encounter. The synthesized voice that filled the command deck was flat and without urgency, which made it worse. System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked. Every console on the deck went dark simultaneously. Not the darkness of a power failure. The precise, deliberate darkness of a system that has decided to stop cooperating. The holographic display pulsed once red and then became a surface of static. The environmental lighting shifted from operational blue to emergency red. The ventilation sound changed pitch, and then a second alarm began. This one was different from the first. Higher, more insistent. The kind of sound that bypasses cognition and speaks directly to something older. Containment field anomaly detected. Core coolant system status offline. Personnel advised to initiate emergency egress protocol. Fenn released the woman's arm. He turned to his crew. Report. His voice was still controlled, but it was controlled the way a structure is controlled when it has taken damage and is working hard to remain standing. The young officer at the primary systems console looked at his captain with the expression of a person who has opened a door expecting a hallway and found a cliff. Sir, we've lost primary control. All command access is offline. The system is locking us out. Override it. Sir, the override protocols are part of the lock system. I can't access the override without the system access I've been locked out of. Then get me someone who can. Mother, sir, the communications board is part of the lock system. Fenn crossed to the board in 4 steps and looked at it himself. The screen was dark, not the soft dark of sleep mode, the hard dark of refusal. He straightened. He had been in difficult situations before. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who imposed solutions. He turned to the room and began imposing. He assigned 3 officers to the primary console. He sent 2 more to the engineering terminal on the port side. He directed a petty officer to attempt manual access through the physical maintenance panels beneath the secondary command station. He spoke with clarity and speed and the absolute conviction of a man who knows that leadership is the act of generating forward motion in the face of resistance. The problem was that the resistance was absolute. Every terminal was dark. Every keyboard produced nothing. Every screen that was not showing red static was showing nothing at all. The maintenance panels responded to physical switches the way a door responds when it has been locked from the inside. The sounds of people working hard to accomplish nothing filled the command deck. And then the facility's ventilation system shifted again. Not the ordinary shift of a system cycling through a temperature adjustment, a different kind of shift. A mechanical dropping of pressure in the atmosphere of the room, subtle enough that most people felt it without being able to identify what they were feeling. Pryor identified it. He had grown up in a house with an old boiler. He had learned young what it sounded like when pressure systems failed. He knew that sound the way you know the sound of something building toward a consequence. He looked at the beta on his own screen, which was one of the few screens still partially operational because his secondary monitoring console was on a circuit that Protocol Omega had not yet completely absorbed. He saw the coolant system status. He understood what it meant. The Protocol Omega system in its activated state was operating on corrupted logic. The pre-exercise load from Black Spear had generated energy signatures that the protocol had misclassified as indicators of an active external attack. It had responded by doing what it was designed to do. It had locked everything. And now locked into its own recursive error, it was interpreting the facility's own systems as evidence of continued attack. It was escalating with each new data point, and the escalation had reached the coolant systems. The quantum processing core at the heart of NTC-7 required continuous cooling to function. The coolant system used liquid helium cycled through a containment loop at temperatures that made the coldest places on Earth seem temperate. If the coolant loop was taken offline, the core temperature would begin to rise. The safeguards built into the physical system would attempt to compensate. Those safeguards had a threshold. Beyond that threshold, the system's response was to vent. Venting liquid helium into a sealed underground environment was not a survivable event. Pryor became aware that the aft emergency door was sealed. Protocol Omega had locked it along with everything else. He became aware that one of the facility's technicians, a petty officer second class named Wharton, had been in the secondary hardware bay conducting routine maintenance when the lockdown occurred. The secondary hardware bay had its own sealed door. Wharton was on the other side of it, and the door was not opening. Pryor looked at his screen. He looked at the coolant status. He calculated what he was able to calculate and arrived at a number that he wished he had not arrived at. 15 minutes, possibly 17 if the buffer held at its upper threshold. He looked at the woman in the flight suit. She had not moved from the server rack. In a room that had become a controlled study in escalating panic, she was the single stationary element. She had not raised her voice. She had not attempted to assist anyone. She had not retreated to a corner. She stood where she had been standing when Fenn pushed her against the rack, her back still near its surface, her tablet still in her hand, her eyes moving across the room with a quality of attention that was different from anything else currently present on the deck. It was not the attention of someone watching a crisis unfold. It was the attention of someone confirming that what is unfolding more directly. She reached into the pocket of her flight suit. Her fingers found what they were looking for without searching. The cable was small, coiled tight. The interface cable that Pryor had noticed earlier in her chest pocket. Legacy hardware. The kind that had been superseded by wireless protocols years ago and was now considered obsolete on any modern command deck. You would not find it on a standard issue kit list for anyone currently serving. She held it in her hand for one moment. She looked at the room. She looked at Fenn, who was pressing his face close to a dead communications panel, as though the speaking itself might bring it back to life. She looked at Pryor. He was the only person in the room looking at her. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she had registered him, that his noticing her had been noted, that this was not an accident. Then she turned and walked toward the starboard wall, not hurrying, not hesitating, the walk of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has known it since before they entered the room. She stopped at a terminal near the aft end of the starboard bank that no one had approached a secondary engineering interface that had been dark and unused for as long as anyone on this shift could remember, and crouched slightly to examine the panel below it. The maintenance port was there. She straightened and plugged one end of the cable into her tablet. She crouched again and plugged the other end into the port. She stood. Her fingers touched the screen, and she began. There is a particular quality to silence that only exists in rooms full of people who are all pretending to act. The command deck of NTC-7 Sentinel had arrived at that silence. 12 officers and enlisted personnel were moving, speaking, pressing keys, turning to one another with the physical vocabulary of coordinated response. And none of it was producing anything. They were performing action the way a drowning man performs swimming. The motions were correct. The outcome was the same regardless. Captain Ellison Fenn stood at the center of it. He had reorganized his personnel twice in the span of 4 minutes. He had assigned and reassigned, directed and redirected moving human resources around a problem that was not a human resources problem. The facility was locked from the inside, by its own architecture, by a protocol that no one on this deck had ever seen activated, and no one, including the man who had designed the exercise that triggered it, had understood well enough to anticipate. He did not say this. He would not have been able to form the thought precisely, even if the words had been available to him. What he experienced instead was a pressure behind his sternum that he had felt exactly twice before in his career. Once in the Gulf, when a communications failure during a live operation had left his unit isolated for 11 hours. Once during a fitness evaluation at the Naval War College, when a professor had asked him a question he had not prepared for, and he had heard the silence in the room swell around the absence of his answer. Both times he had found his way through by talking, by projecting, by filling the space with himself until the space stopped being a problem. He was talking now. Whitmore. Status on the secondary coolant bypass. Sir, the bypass controls are part of the locked interface. I can't reach them through this terminal. Then reach them through a different terminal. Sir, I've tried 4 terminals. They're all locked to the same protocol. Try the one on the port side aft. Sir, Lieutenant Okafor is already at the port side aft. Then try the one beside it. The officer went to the one beside it. It was dark. It had been dark for the last 6 minutes. It remained dark. Fenn turned to the next problem. This was what command looked like from the inside when the tools of command had been removed. You did not stop. You could not stop. Because stopping was the thing you were not permitted to do, and so you continued doing everything that was not stopping, and the continuing itself became its own form of forward motion even when no ground was being covered. Ensign Garrett Pryor was covering ground, not physically. He hadn't left his station since the alarms began, but the secondary monitoring console at his position was still partially active, still feeding him fragmentary data from the subsystems that Protocol Omega had not yet fully absorbed. And Pryor was using those fragments the way a navigator uses stars, not as a destination, as a reference, as a way of establishing where things were in relation to where they were supposed to be. The coolant system status was the thing he kept returning to. The numbers were not good. The liquid helium containment loop had been offline for 9 minutes. The core temperature was rising at a rate that was for the moment within the buffer zone that the physical safeguards could manage. But the buffer zone had a ceiling, and the rate of increase was not slowing. It was accelerating slowly, the kind of slowly that becomes fast before you have finished describing it as slow. He ran the calculation again. He had run it 4 times. The result was the same each time because mathematics does not negotiate. 15 minutes, possibly 17. The number did not improve with repetition. He looked at the aft emergency door. Sealed. He looked at the secondary hardware bay on the starboard side. Also sealed. Petty Officer Wharton was still inside it. Pryor could see on his partial monitoring feed that the bay's internal communications were offline. Wharton did not know the state of the room he was locked out of. The room did not know the state of the man locked inside. Pryor looked at the woman. She was at the maintenance port. Her tablet was connected. Her fingers were on the screen. He watched her hands. There was a quality to the movement that he found difficult to process in the moment and would spend a long time thinking about afterward. He had seen people type quickly before. He had seen technicians and programmers work at speeds that seemed to exceed what the human hand ought to be capable of. What Weston was doing was not that. It was not speed. It was something else. A fluency. The difference between a person who has learned a language and a person who dreams in it. Every gesture was exact and without redundancy. There was no searching, no backtracking, no pause that indicated uncertainty. Each movement arrived with the completeness of something that had been decided before the hand began to move. The code scrolling across her tablet was unlike anything Pryor had seen in 4 years of technical training. It was not written in any of the standard naval cyber systems languages he had studied. It was not written in any language he recognized at all. It looked to his eye like something that had preceded the languages he knew, like the thing that those languages had been built to approximate. He watched her, and he thought without meaning to think it that he was watching someone speak to a building in the building's own language. Fenn saw her at the terminal after 7 minutes. He had been covering the room in a pattern that was half tactical and half desperate, moving from station to station, trying to find the one point of entry that would crack the lockdown open and let him back into command of his own facility. He turned from the port-side engineering bank, and his eyes snagged on her. She was adjusting something in the connection at the maintenance port, and then she straightened, and her fingers moved. He crossed the deck. "What are you doing?" Not a question. The inflection of a man reading a violation report. She didn't answer. "Step away from that terminal. You don't have authorization to touch that interface. Whatever you're doing, you are making this worse." She turned a line of code. "I am giving you a direct order. Step away from the terminal." Her fingers did not stop. "Sir." The voice came from behind him, low but direct. He turned. Pryor, standing a foot from his own station, looking at his captain with an expression that was not insubordination and was not quite anything else. "Sir," Pryor's voice was steadier than he expected it to be. "The coolant temperature. We have approximately 15 minutes before the system reaches the vent threshold. If the system vents in a sealed environment." He paused. "Sir, we should let her finish." Fenn looked at Pryor. He looked at the woman. He looked at the terminal. He looked back at Pryor. There was a calculation happening in his face. You could see it happening. It was the calculation a man makes when the variables in the room have stopped being the variables he prepared for. When the model he carries in his head for how a situation works is presenting him with outcomes the model was not built to produce. He took one step back from the terminal. Not because he had decided she was right to be there. Because Pryor had said 15 minutes, and Fenn, who was many things, was not a man who ignored a hard number. The room reorganized itself around her without meaning to. It was not a decision anyone made. It was the natural physics of a crisis room when the crisis has exceeded the room's capacity to resolve it. People move toward the thing that is working. They cannot help it. It is older than training, older than protocol. It is the thing that kept human beings alive in the dark for 100,000 years before anyone thought to write a manual Bornishrom. One by one, the officers stopped pressing dark keys and turned to watch. Fenn remained at the center of the room. He did not watch. He stood with his back half turned to the terminal, facing the holographic display, in its surface of red static, his posture still that of command, but command of what now was a question that had no clean answer. Pryor watched. Krause in the shadow by the aft door watched. On the main holographic display, in the center of the swirling red, something happened that took Pryor 4 seconds to fully register. A line appeared. White. It drew itself slowly, a single continuous curve beginning at a point slightly left of center in the storm of red and moving with a steadiness that was almost meditative outward, outward, outward until it closed on itself. A circle. Perfect. Surrounded on all sides by red chaos and completely unnervingly still. Pryor thought of a surgeon's first incision. The way the action once committed makes the surrounding disorder comprehensible, gives it a frame. He looked at Weston's hands. That was when he saw it. She was deep in a sequence, her fingers moving through something complex. And then without warning, her hands stopped, not slowed, stopped, for 2 seconds. He counted them because the silence of her hands in the middle of that sequence was loud enough to count against. He looked at her face. She was looking at the screen. Her jaw was set, not rigid. Set the way you set something when you are carrying weight and you have adjusted your body to manage it for the duration. He looked at her hands. They were trembling, faintly. The tremor of someone exerting control over something that is pushing back. Not fear. He knew what frightened hands looked like. He had seen his own once the night before his first real operational assessment. This was not that. This was the weight of knowing. Weston knew in those 2 seconds precisely what she was holding. She was holding the outcome. The system in its corrupted state had created a condition with a single viable resolution path, and that path was the one she was on, and she was 3 steps from the end of it. If she had miscalculated anything in the preceding sequence, the step she was about to take would not correct the system. It would tell the system that the correction had been attempted and failed, and the system's response to a failed correction attempt was recorded in the Protocol Omega documentation in language that was technically precise and absolutely final. She held that knowledge for 2 seconds. Pryor held his breath. Then her hands resumed. He exhaled. He didn't know when he had started holding his breath. He realized his own hands were gripping the edge of his console. He released them. He pressed them flat against his thighs. He watched her finish. The first thing that changed was the white circle. It expanded. Not quickly, the way light expands when someone adjusts a lens. Smoothly, with purpose. It pushed against the red static at its perimeter, and the red gave way. Not all at once, but in a recession that was visible that you could watch, happening, the boundary moving outward as the white reclaimed the display centimeter by centimeter. Then the first alarm stopped. The wailing tone that had been occupying the top of the room's sound since the lockdown began simply ceased. The silence it left was enormous. Several people made sounds they would not have made if they had been in control of themselves. Small sounds, involuntary. The sounds a body makes when something that has been tightening suddenly releases. Then the synthesized voice mid-sentence in its evacuation warning stopped speaking. The emergency lighting held red for 4 more seconds. Then it shifted back through amber, back to the operational blue that the deck had been wearing when the morning began. The shift was slow enough that the crew could feel it before they could see it clearly, the warmth of the familiar color returning to the surfaces of the room. The holographic display dissolved its red surface and rebuilt itself from the inside out. The black of cleared space. Then the star chart. Then the simulation theater grid. Then the carrier strike group icons, each appearing in sequence, each in its correct position, each tagged with the correct identifiers. The pre-exercise state of black spear intact as though nothing had interrupted it. The consoles came back in a wave that moved from the starboard side to the port. Screens lit, keyboards produced responses, status indicators returned to their correct colors. The aft emergency doors locked, disengaged with a sound like a held breath being released. The secondary hardware bay door opened. Petty Officer Wharton stepped out into the corridor, looked at the faces of the crew members nearest to him, and said nothing because the faces told him enough. The deck ventilation shifted back to its normal pitch. The temperature began to stabilize. The overhead lights steadied. In 90 seconds, Admiral Claire Weston had walked a catastrophic system failure backward through its own architecture and returned NTC-7 Sentinel to its pre-incident state. The room was absolutely still. She unplugged the cable from the maintenance port. She coiled it with 3 precise rotations of her wrist, the same 3 rotations she had used when she pulled it from her pocket and pressed it back into place in the chest pocket of her flight suit. She straightened. She looked at the holographic display for a moment. The star chart rotated slowly in the blue light. She examined it the way a surgeon examines a closed incision, looking for anything that needed one more pass. She found nothing. She turned. The room looked back at her. Fenn stood by the command chair. His hand was resting on its back. Not gripping it, resting there the way a hand comes to rest on something solid when the floor has stopped being reliable. His face had undergone several revisions in the last 90 seconds and had not yet settled on a final expression. He had pushed this woman against a server rack less than 20 minutes ago. He had dismissed her with the full weight of his rank and his certainty and his considerable talent for condescension. He had told her she was in the wrong place. He had spent 43 years being the most consequential presence in every room he entered. He had organized his entire existence around that fact. His decorations, his posture, his voice, the way he placed his cover on a console with 2 fingers at the brim. All of it had been architecture. A structure built for the purpose of being seen and registered and acknowledged as significant. She had not registered him. Not in the way that mattered. She had registered his actions, his errors, the technical conditions his behavior had created in the room. She had registered him the way a diagnostician registers a symptom, not as a person of consequence. As a data point in a system she understood far more completely than he had ever understood his own reflection. That was the thing that had no narrative available to it. The professional consequences, the formal inquiry, the reassignment. A man could build stories around those. Institutions act on individuals. That is the natural order of things, and natural orders can be survived with the right framing. But there was no framing available for the experience of being looked at by someone who had already finished looking. The aft door opened. Commodore Bernard Krause walked through it. He was accompanied by 2 Marines from the base security detail. He had requested them 20 minutes earlier from his position at the remote monitoring station in his office, where he had watched the morning's events with his hands folded in his lap and a stillness that had unnerved the Marine corporal beside him. He had not spoken during the monitoring. He had watched the woman work, and his stillness had been the stillness of confirmed expectation, not shock. He walked across the command deck with the measured pace of someone who knows the weight of each step they are taking. He did not look at the consoles. He did not look at the crew. He did not look at Fenn. He walked to Admiral Claire Weston and stopped 3 feet from her. He drew himself to his full height, and he saluted. Not the salute of an officer acknowledging a peer. Not the salute of a man performing a required courtesy. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover with the precision and the deliberateness of a man who has decided that this gesture will be one of the precise and deliberate ones. The salute of a subordinate to a superior of significant rank. The kind of salute that contains within it an entire reckoning. "Admiral Weston," he said. His voice was the voice of 31 years of service, and it filled the room with a particular quality of weight. "My apologies for the reception. I was not informed you would be conducting your inspection personally today. This facility is yours to command." The word arrived in the room and occupied it completely. "Admiral." The crew heard it the way you hear the word that rearranges everything that came before it. The soft collective intake of breath was the sound of a room revising its understanding of the last 40 minutes. Revising it and finding that the revision made everything clearer, which was somehow worse than the alternative. Weston gave a slight nod, the nod of someone accepting an acknowledgement they did not require but receive with appropriate recognition. "Commodore," she said. Her voice for most of the crew was a new thing. It was even, calibrated, a voice that had decided long ago that volume was not the variable it was interested in adjusting. "Your facility has a vulnerability in its core architecture." She spoke to the room, not to Krause alone. Her eyes moved across the crew with the same quality of attention she had given the holographic display when she was confirming the repair. Protocol Omega contains a recursive loop that can be triggered by a specific data packet sequence generated under Black Spear load conditions. When that packet is received during a live exercise, initialization, the protocol interprets it as a real-world intrusion event. It locks the system and begins monitoring for secondary attack indicators. The Black Spear simulation's own operational signatures satisfy those indicators. The protocol escalates. Each escalation generates new signatures. The system reads those signatures as escalating attack conditions. The loop feeds itself. She looked at Fenn. "Your command staff was not prepared for a systems-level cascade failure. They are trained to operate this facility. They are not trained to understand it. That is a critical vulnerability, not in the architecture, in the personnel. Not an accusation, a diagnosis, delivered with the detached precision of someone who has spent a career making the distinction between those two things." Fenn said nothing. There was nothing available to say. Krause lowered his salute. He moved to a data terminal near the aft wall and entered a command sequence. A holographic file opened in the air beside him. The crew, despite themselves, looked at it. The header read, Weston Claire M. Vice Admiral USN. Below it, the service record scrolled. U.S. Cyber Command, Special Operations Directorate. Director Project Chimera. Distinguished Service Medal. Defense Superior Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Legion of Merit. The list continued. Each entry a chapter in a career conducted so far beneath the surface of the visible record that none of the people in this room, including Fenn, would have encountered her name in any document they had been cleared to read. Education Doctorate in Quantum Computing, MIT. Doctorate in Systems Architecture, Caltech. Graduate of the Navy's Advanced Cyber Operations Program, Classification Level 4. Prior read the final line, Mission Classifications, Top Secret SCI, Eyes Only. He looked at the woman who had 2 seconds of trembling hands and a legacy cable in her chest pocket in a way of writing code that looked like a different civilization's mathematics. He thought about the white line on his monitoring screen, the one that had appeared before the alarms, the one that had vanished before anything else happened. He pulled the notation up on his console, the timestamp he had recorded. He ran a verification query against the system's architecture log, the kind of query that found the origin point of a data structure, where it was written, when it was written. The result came back in 11 seconds. He looked at the result. He looked at it again. He looked at Weston. She was standing with the same quality of presence she had held all morning, unassuming, occupying exactly the space she intended to occupy and no more. Pryor stood. The movement was involuntary or close enough to it. You do not decide to stand when you are holding a number that changes everything. You stand because remaining seated becomes structurally impossible. Admiral, his voice came out more steady than he expected. She turned and looked at him. The gray eyes, the still water. Admiral. He was aware that his hand was not quite steady on the console's edge. He chose not to correct for it. This vulnerability, Protocol Omega's recursive loop. I ran an architecture trace on the anomaly that appeared on my monitoring feed before the lockdown. I traced its origin point in the system. He looked at his screen. He looked at her. The timestamp on this code structure is 20 years old. The room was quiet. It wasn't written in by accident, he said. It was placed here, deliberately, when this facility's foundational architecture was first built. He had the full technical notation, the architecture coordinates, the verification hash that confirmed the timestamp against 3 independent system records. He had all of it, but he stopped because of her face. It had not changed, not dramatically, not in any way that a person watching from across the room would have been able to describe. But Pryor was close enough. He was looking at her directly, and he saw the thing that happened at the corner of her mouth. It was small, almost nothing. A movement that lasted less than a second and did not complete itself into anything that could be called a smile. But it was there, and in it he read something that he would spend the next several years of his life working to understand. The recognition of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for a specific question to be asked. Who has arranged the conditions under which the question might be asked? Who has sat with the patience of someone who understands that the right questions do not arrive on schedule, that they arrive only when someone has developed the precise combination of curiosity and rigor and the particular lack of ego necessary to find them? She held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned back to the room, and her voice was as even and measured as it had been before, and she continued speaking. But Garrett Pryor remained standing. Because sitting back down at this particular moment in this particular room on this particular morning was something he found he was simply unable to do. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a verdict, not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen, not the silence of people who have run out of things to say. The silence that follows a verdict is different. It has texture. It has weight. It is the silence of people who are in the process of accepting something they cannot change, each of them doing that work alone in the particular interior space that no one else has access to. The command deck of NTC-7 Sentinel held that silence for a long moment after Garrett Pryor sat back down. Then Commodore Bernard Krause turned from the holographic service record and looked at Captain Ellison Fenn. He did not speak immediately. Krause had learned over 31 years that the pause before words was often the most important part of what you had to say. He let the pause exist. He let Fenn stand in it. Fenn was standing at the command chair with his hand resting on its back. He had not moved in several minutes. Around him, the command deck had returned to full operational status. Every console lit, every system nominal. The holographic display rotating its serene pre-exercise star chart as though the last 40 minutes had been a test of the equipment rather than of the men and women responsible for it. The contrast was complete and unkind. The facility was fine. The facility had been fine the moment Weston finished her work at the maintenance port. It was only the people who were still sorting through damage. Captain Fenn, Krause said. Fenn looked at him. Admiral Weston is the lead architect of the NTC-7 Sentinel program. She designed the foundational framework of this facility's operating system when she held the rank of commander 20 years ago. Krause spoke without inflection. This was not a speech. It was a recitation of facts being placed in a room so that their weight could be properly distributed. She wrote the core code for every system on this deck, including Protocol Omega, including the vulnerability that you and your crew were unable to address, including the maintenance port interface through which she resolved a crisis that without her intervention would have required mandatory evacuation of this facility and a formal incident report to the Chief of Naval Operations. Fenn said nothing. She is also, as you are now aware, a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy and the director of one of the most classified operational programs in the history of U.S. Cyber Command. A beat. You grabbed her by the arm and pushed her against a wall. The words landed the way a flat stone lands on still water, not with a splash, with a spreading. The two Marines from the security detail took a half step forward. The movement was small. It was sufficient. You are relieved of command, Captain. Effective immediately. You will be escorted to your quarters and will remain there pending notification of further proceedings from Naval Station Norfolk's Judge Advocate Office. Krause paused. He held up one hand a fraction of an inch, and the Marines held. He stepped to Fenn's side. Close. The distance of a private conversation in a room full of people who are pretending not to listen. She received the behavioral reports in August, Krause said. His voice was below the ambient sound of the deck. For Fenn only. 3 months of documented complaints from your subordinates. 2 junior officers who requested transfers rather than file formally. A petty officer who filed formally and then withdrew the complaint when she understood what withdrawal would cost her. Fenn looked straight ahead. Weston read every report, Krause continued. She requested the Black Spear exercise schedule. She chose this week, this specific day. She knew that the Black Spear load sequence would trigger the Protocol Omega loop under the right conditions. She designed that loop. She understood exactly what would happen when the exercise began. A pause, the weight of it settling. This was not an unannounced inspection, Captain. It was a designed evaluation of the facility, of its systems, of the man in command of both. Fenn said nothing. She came here knowing what she would find, Krause said. In every category. He stepped back. Fenn turned toward the door. Weston spoke. Captain Fenn. He stopped. He turned back. He did not fully understand why. Some remnant of the training that had made him, the training that told you to turn when an admiral spoke your name, regardless of context, regardless of what it cost you. She looked at him without any of the things he deserved. You were the best tactician in your class, she said. That was never the question. He stood with that for a moment. He searched her face one final time. He was looking for the satisfaction of it. The vindication, the small human pleasure of a person who has been underestimated and has now been proven correct in the most definitive way available. He had humiliated her in front of a room full of people, and the room had watched, and now the room was watching this, and the symmetry of that was so complete that it demanded some acknowledgement from her face. There was none. What he found was the same expression she had held all morning, the attentive neutrality of someone confirming that a problem has been correctly resolved. He was the problem. He had been resolved. She was confirming. He turned and walked through the door. The Marines fell in on either side of him, not touching him, not restraining him, simply present in the way that authority is present when it no longer needs to assert itself. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled. Weston stayed for 7 days. There was no announcement, no scheduling notice distributed to the crew, no formal declaration of a teaching period. She simply did not leave. Each morning she arrived on the command deck at 700, wearing the same olive drab flight suit, carrying the same tablet, and she moved through the facility with the unhurried attention of someone who is interested in what they are looking at. She did not lecture. She did not call the crew to formation and deliver remarks about the lessons of the preceding week. She did not post new protocols or circulate revised operating procedures. What she did was sit. She would appear beside a junior officer at their console, uninvited, unannounced, and settle into the seat next to them with the ease of someone who has spent decades making themselves comfortable in the presence of complex systems. She would look at their screen for a moment. Then she would ask a question, not the questions that superior officers usually ask, which are examinations in the shape of questions, inquiries that already contain their answers and are waiting for you to locate the correct one. She asked the kind of questions that open things rather than close them. Why is this written this way? What does this subsystem do when that one fails? If you had to rebuild this interface from nothing, what would you keep and what would you remove? The junior officers, initially terrified, discovered something unexpected within the first day. She was genuinely curious about their answers, not performing curiosity. She listened to what they said and actually thought about it in the visible way of a person who is processing new input rather than confirming existing conclusions. Sometimes she would modify her own position based on what she heard. She would say, that is a better approach than what I was using 20 years ago. and the officer who had said it would stare at her for a moment, trying to determine whether they had misheard. They had not misheard. Garrett Pryor received this treatment on the third day. She appeared beside his console at 0840, set her tablet face down on the surface next to his keyboard, and looked at his monitoring feed. She did not speak for almost a minute. Pryor continued working because it was the only reasonable response available to him, and because he had already learned in the 3 days since the incident that silence in Weston's proximity was not a problem to be solved. "You noted the anomaly before the lockdown," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You noted it and you didn't report it immediately." "No, ma'am. I wasn't certain what it was. I didn't want to interrupt the pre-exercise sequence over something I couldn't characterize." She considered this. "What made you keep the notation?" "It was the wrong color," he said. "Everything else on the feed was within expected parameters. The anomaly didn't match anything I'd been trained to recognize. But it didn't match the pattern of the system in a way that felt like noise. It felt like it was doing something." He paused. "I know that's not a technical description." "It is a precise description," she said. "You recognize the signal without being able to classify it. That is a different skill from classification. Most people don't develop it. Most training programs don't try to teach it." He looked at his screen. "What is it called?" "Nothing useful. It gets called intuition, which is a word people use for pattern recognition they cannot yet articulate." She picked up her tablet. "It took you 11 seconds to run the architecture trace after the repair. That's fast." "I'd been thinking about the query structure since I first saw the anomaly. I had most of it already built." She stood. He had perhaps 9 seconds before the conversation closed. "Admiral, the code you used at the maintenance port, the sequence that resolved the protocol Omega loop." He kept his eyes on his console. "I pulled it from the system log. I've been looking at it for 2 days." She waited. "It doesn't read like the other code in the architecture. The foundational code from 20 years ago, the base layer that everything was built on top of. That looks like one thing." He looked at her. "The repair sequence looks like something written for a different version of the system. Like it was calibrated to a system that didn't exist when it was written." She looked at him for a long moment. "It was," she said. He held that. "You wrote the solution in advance. Before the system had become the system you were writing the solution for." She said nothing, which was itself an answer. He pulled up the repair sequence on his screen. He had been running it backward and forward for 2 days, mapping its decision logic, charting the way each step created the conditions for the next. He had the shape of it now. He understood what it was doing, if not entirely how she had known to write it that way so many years before. "The thing I keep coming back to," he said, "is that it doesn't read like functional code. Functional code does the and that's enough. This reads like something else." He searched for the word and found unexpectedly the right one. "It reads like poetry." She was quiet for a moment. "Efficiency is its own form of elegance, Ensign," she said. "Never use 10 words when 2 will do. The same is true of code." She paused once. "The same is true of leadership." She stood and moved toward the next station. He looked at the sequence on his screen. At the particular way it was structured, each step earned by the previous one, each line carrying its own justification within the logic of the line before it. Nothing wasted, nothing performing, every element doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing more. He did not look up until she had moved 2 stations down. That evening, after his shift ended and the overnight crew had settled into their reduced configuration, someone placed a small metal plaque on the port bulkhead beside the secondary maintenance terminal. No one admitted to placing it. No one asked. It appeared between the end of Weston's 5th day and the beginning of the 6th, sometime in the quiet hours when the command deck held its night configuration and the only sounds were the server hum and the slow rotation of navigational data on the holographic display. The plaque read, "Efficiency is its own form of elegance." It was not regulation. It was not approved by anyone in any formal capacity. The officer standing watch that morning looked at it for a long time and decided without formally deciding anything that the matter did not require his attention. The crew called the spot the Admiral's Corner. Before long, officers passing it on their way to stations would lay a hand briefly on its surface. Not a gesture anyone had been taught. Not a tradition anyone had established. A thing that began because it was the natural response to the presence of something that meant more than its surface. Ellis and Fenn arrived at the Creech Logistics Depot in southern Nevada on a Thursday in late October. The drive from the airfield took 20 minutes through terrain that was the particular shade of brown that the desert achieves when summer has left and nothing else has decided to arrive. The landscape did not attempt to be scenic. It simply existed flat and enormous and indifferent, which Fenn found in a way he had not anticipated restful. The depot occupied a tract of land that looked from the road like a series of large metal buildings arranged without aesthetic consideration, which was exactly what it was. Inside it held the material reality of the naval logistics chain, the spare parts, the maintenance equipment, the supply inventories that kept operational units functional in the ways that operational units rarely thought about. Things arrived. Things were processed. Things went where they needed to go. His official title was Logistics Coordination Officer. He did not have a command. He had a desk, a filing system, and a subordinate staff who received the news of his posting with the cautious neutrality of people who have learned not to form expectations. He sat at the desk on the first morning and looked at the inbox. He read it 3 times. He had spent the 2 weeks after his relief from NTC-7 preparing his formal response to the judge advocate's inquiry. His counsel had advised him on the precise language of acknowledgement and accountability that would satisfy the requirements. The process was not vindictive. That was the thing he had prepared himself for that never arrived. He had expected institutional anger, the machinery of consequence, bearing down with the full weight of what he had done. What he experienced instead was the institution's equivalent of Weston's own response, a precise methodical assessment of a problem and a proportional correction. He had committed a serious breach. The breach had been addressed. He had been moved to a position where the breach was less likely to recur and where his capabilities could be applied to tasks that did not require him to be unsupervised in a room with people who had no recourse. It was not dramatic. He had half wanted it to be dramatic. The drama would have been a form of continued importance. A court-martial was at minimum a forum. It meant people were paying attention. It meant you still occupied a position significant enough to require a formal response. A logistics posting was different. A logistics posting was a door closing quietly in an empty hallway. He read the inbox again. He began to work. The depot's most effective employee was a petty officer, first class, named Greer, a man in his early 40s who had been at Creech for 6 years and who had developed what appeared to be a complete and intuitive map of the entire facility's inventory in his head. Greer could tell you, without consulting a database, whether a specific component for a specific aircraft was in Building 3 or Building 7, how many units were on hand when the last shipment had arrived and when the next one was scheduled. He conveyed this information in sentences of approximately 7 words. Fenn observed him for 3 days before saying anything to him. He had not in his previous career been a man who observed before speaking. He had been a man who assessed rapidly and acted on the assessment. The tempo of NTC-7 had demanded it. The tempo of the logistics depot did not demand anything. The depot moved at the speed of a well-maintained system, which was neither fast nor slow but steady, and the steadiness was its own form of excellence, invisible until it was interrupted. On the 4th day, Fenn watched Greer navigate a receiving discrepancy involving 3 pallets of mislabeled components, without raising his voice, without consulting a supervisor, and without creating any documentation that would require follow-up. The problem was solved in 11 minutes. The solution left no trace except the correct components in their correct locations and a brief note in the receiving log. Fenn walked over after. "That discrepancy," he said. "The vendor manifest didn't match the physical inventory." "No, sir," Greer said. "How did you know where to look without the correct documentation?" Greer considered the question with the seriousness he appeared to give all questions. "I know what we're short on, sir. When something comes in mislabeled, I start with what we need and work backward." Fenn thought about that. "That's not in the receiving protocol," he said. "No, sir. The protocol works for the normal cases. For the other cases, you need something else." "What do you call that?" Greer thought about it for a moment. "Just paying attention, sir." He walked back to his work. Fenn stood in the receiving bay for a long time after. Outside, the Nevada desert conducted its usual business of being enormous and unconcerned. The overhead lights were fluorescent and did not flatter the concrete floor. The work around him was the work of sustaining things, of keeping operational capacity intact through the management of 10,000 small decisions made correctly and unremarkably day after day by people who would never stand in a room with a holographic display. He thought about a woman in an olive drab flight suit standing perfectly still beside a command node while the room moved around her. He thought about the 2 seconds when her hands had trembled over the keyboard. He had not been close enough to see it himself, but he had seen Pryor's face in those 2 seconds, and Pryor's face had told him everything. Not that she had failed, that she had borne it, that she had picked up the weight of it and carried it forward and put it down only when the work was done. He thought about the photograph in his desk drawer at NTC-7, the one he had not taken with him when the Marines walked him out. He had not thought to take it, and then later, with some distance, he had decided it was correct that he had not. Douglas Fenn had built his son in the image of a man who needed an audience for his excellence, who required witnesses to confirm the value of his work. That requirement had structured everything. Every decision, every posture, every polished boot and corrected junior officer. All of it in service of being seen. The photograph stayed at Norfolk. What Ellison Fenn did with what remained was his. He picked up a clipboard from the receiving station. He began reviewing the afternoon's incoming manifest. He did it carefully. He did it without an audience. 31 days after Weston's departure from NTC-7, Garrett Pryor received a package. It arrived through the standard internal naval mail system, processed and handled by an indeterminate number of people between origin and delivery, bearing the marks of that journey on its exterior. The packaging was standard issue, durable, brown. Nothing about it indicated where it had come from. There was no return address. His name and posting were printed in a clean, small font that gave nothing away. He opened it at his console after his shift ended, in the quieting of the deck, as the evening watch took over the overhead lights, adjusting to their lower operational setting, and the hum of the servers settling into the register they held through the night. Inside the packaging was a data slate, not new exactly, not old. The kind of device that had been maintained with the same consistency with which everything in Weston's orbit appeared to have been maintained. Functional, without superfluity. He turned it on. The screen displayed a single directory. The directory was titled NTC-7 Sentinel Foundational Architecture. Source code annotated. He opened it. What was inside was the entire original source code for the NTC-7 Sentinel operating system as it had been written 20 years earlier. Every line, every function, every protocol, including Protocol Omega, including the vulnerability, including the architecture beneath the architecture that determined how all of it fit together. Beside each section in the annotation margins were notes. Not the notes of a manual, not the explanatory language of a document written for a reader who needs to be led. The notes of a person thinking on paper, thinking about why they had made each decision, thinking about what the alternatives had been, thinking about what would happen to the code as the years accumulated and the systems built on top of it diverged from the original. The notes were a conversation with a future reader. He scrolled through for an hour, then two. The evening watch came and went. The overnight watch settled in. The deck went to its night configuration, quieter, dimmer. He sat at his console and read. Near the end of the directory, after the main source files in the annotation layers, there was a folder he had not opened. Unlabeled. No title. Just a folder icon sitting at the bottom of the directory like something that had been placed there without calling attention to itself. He opened it. Inside was a single video file. The file name was a date, 20 years prior to the day. He pressed play. The footage was the quality you expected from 20 years ago. Not poor, functional. A fixed camera mounted in a working environment. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the date and added a time 0317 hours. A room, not a large room, a working space. Whiteboards covered in notation along two walls. A desk in the center with 3 monitors. Component hardware in various states of assembly on a secondary table. At the desk, a woman, 20 years younger. The silver at her temples not yet present. The face the same face, but without the particular quality of stillness that Pryor now associated with her. Not because she was agitated, because the stillness had not yet finished developing. She was in her mid-30s in this footage. She had the focused energy of someone in the middle of something that has taken a long time and is nearly complete. She was looking at one of the monitors. As Pryor watched her hands on the keyboard in front of her, executed a sequence. He could not see the screen clearly, but he could read her hands well enough to understand that the sequence was a final one, the kind of keystrokes that complete a thing rather than continue it. She sat back. She looked at the monitor for a long moment. Then she looked at the camera. She had known it was there. That was clear from the way she looked at it. Not the accidental look of someone who has forgotten a camera is present. The deliberate look of someone who placed it and is now looking into it because they have something to say and have chosen this method of saying it. She was quiet for a moment, the way you are quiet before something that needs to be said correctly. Then she spoke. Her voice was younger, the same calibration, the same precision, but without the weight that the following 20 years would settle into it. If you found this, she said, you're asking the right questions? A pause. That's enough. She looked at the camera for a moment longer. Then she looked back at her monitor. Then the footage ended. Pryor sat in the low light of the overnight command deck and did not move for a long time. He thought about the white line on his monitoring feed, the one that had appeared and vanished before everything else began. He thought about the 11 seconds it had taken him to run the architecture trace. He thought about the 2 seconds of trembling hands at the maintenance port that no one else in the room had been close enough or attending enough to see. He thought about a woman who had written a solution to a problem 20 years before the problem existed in a language calibrated to a system that would take 20 years to become itself. He thought about what that required, not just the technical capability, which was its own staggering thing, the patience of it, the willingness to build something and leave it to walk away from a 20-year problem and trust that at some point in those 20 years, a specific kind of person would be standing in the right position at the right moment, looking at the right screen, and would see what was there to be seen. He went back to the annotation beside the Protocol Omega vulnerability, the one he had passed over quickly on his first reading. He found it now and read it slowly. This will only be found by someone who is looking for the right thing in the right way. I cannot predict who that will be or when, but the capability to write this was not mine alone. It will not be mine to keep. He read it again. He understood that the data slate was not a gift in the way gifts are usually understood. It was not a reward. It was not recognition of merit in the conventional sense. It was a responsibility in the shape of a gift passed from one set of hands to another, with the implicit understanding that the hands receiving it would in time find their own way of passing it forward. True legacy, he thought, is not the thing you leave in a case for people to look at. It is the thing that continues to move after you have stopped moving it. He closed the directory. He looked at the command deck around him, the overnight crew at their stations. The holographic display cycling slowly through its navigational data in the blue half-light. The server hum, the cold, clean smell of recycled air, and something faintly chemical that no one had ever been able to identify. He stood. He walked to the Admiral's corner. He placed his hand on the plaque. The metal was cool under his palm. The lettering was small and even pressed into the surface without ornamentation. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. He stood there for a moment, not in ceremony, not in any performance directed at anyone, in the particular private stillness of a person who is taking an honest inventory of themselves, who they were when they first walked onto this deck 4 months ago, who they intended to be in the years that were coming, what they were choosing to carry forward and what they were choosing to put down. He took his hand away. He walked back to his station. He sat down. He opened the foundational source file and turned to the first page of annotations. Not Protocol Omega, not the repair sequence, the base layer, the earliest code, the one that everything else had been built on top of, written at 3:17 in the morning by a woman in her mid-30s who had known even then that the most important thing she was building was not the system. It was the question she was leaving inside it. He started reading from the beginning. In a facility in a city he would never visit, Admiral Claire Weston sat at a terminal that looked very much like the terminal she had always worked at in the particular late-hour quiet that she had always worked in, and continued the practice developed over a long career of moving through the world at a volume that required nothing from the world to confirm it. She did not think about NTC-7 Sentinel very often. She thought about this next problem the way she always had, and the one after that, and the architecture that would be required to address them both. She had not thought to follow up on the data slate. She did not know and would not seek to know whether the right person had found it. Either they had or they hadn't. Either they were asking the right questions or they weren't. She had arranged the conditions as best she could. What happened inside those conditions was not hers to manage. That was the part of the work that no one taught you and most people never learn. The part where you build the thing and step back and trust the thing to find the people it needs to find. She worked until 300. She went home. Outside the Nevada desert received the morning the way it received all mornings, without comment, without adjustment. The light arrived and the land was there. And between those two faxon depots and on command decks and in early morning working rooms with whiteboards on the walls, people continued the ordinary, extraordinary work of becoming who they were choosing to become. The question this story leaves with you is not about Admiral Weston. It is not about Ellison Fenn. It is about the white line. The one that appeared for a few seconds on a secondary monitoring screen in the chaos of a Tuesday morning and vanished before anyone else in the room looked up from what they were doing. In every organization you have ever been part of, in every room where the loudest voice set the temperature and the quietest presence set the actual direction. There have been white lines, signals in the noise. Things that were there to be found by whoever was looking in the right direction with the right kind of attention. The question is not whether those lines existed. The question is whether you were the one looking, and if you were looking, what you did after.